Well, today I wanted to talk about deep crises require deep solutions. The second term of President Barack Obama began in a most challenging economic environment, beset by massive unemployment, reluctant investors, weak demand from consumers in the United States, reduced exports to China, the European Union, and Japan. The U.S. economy continued to defy efforts to regain robust economic growth. It had plunged into economic crisis as the Bush presidency was winding down, and the new president faced a dire predicament as he took office. His measures to address challenges at that time, largely supporting banks and corporate bailouts, at best kept a severe recession from becoming a major depression on the order of the 1930s. His efforts failed to significantly address the devastating issues, the devastating losses facing homeowners, workers, and immigrants. Once re-election was in hand, President Obama provided an inaugural speech that seemingly foreshadowed addressing the losses of those most harmed by the economic crisis. Instead, the focus of the economic debate continues to be the fiscal cliff, with an emphasis on a better balance in the federal budget by reducing deficits through increased taxes and further eroding social benefits. Once again, the administration seems to be following an indirect approach towards assisting the distressed members of the community. A more direct approach would seem appropriate. Today's conference builds on Howard's tradition of critical appraisal of the nation's direction. At the midpoint of President Obama's first term, 24 scholars assembled here at Howard to debate approaches to addressing the unemployment crisis in the economy at that time. That conference, in turn, was in the tradition of the 1935 conference here at Howard University, where Howard University economists joined other social scientists addressing the problems of the Great Depression. Participants in that event went on to form a left-wing activist group called the National Negro Congress, which went on to be involved in many, many struggles around the country around issues of the Depression. Abram Harris, the first chair of the economics department of Howard University, was joined by other leading social scientists at that conference in an attempt to move beyond Franklin Roosevelt's programs of labor rights, social security, and welfare by calling for aggressive action for jobs, against racism, and for working class unity and struggle. Now, today's conference, I hope, will continue to build on these past efforts. Those of us who are gathered today are generally focused on seeking approaches to improving the quality of life for millions of people in the United States and to narrow the racial income, wealth, health, education, and housing gaps. Racist inequalities have deepened in the last decade as incomes for African Americans have fallen 10%, while they have fallen 1% among white families. Relative black wealth has fallen even further. Contributing to these savage and growing inequalities, the criminal justice system continues to incarcerate and literally enslave millions, disproportionately black and Latino, many of whom are forced to work practically for free in prison-based industries. Doubtlessly today, many outstanding policy proposals will be made, some modest and some bold. We look forward to hearing them. But I encourage us to think a little bit broader than that. We face a fundamental problem. In a capitalist economic system, economic viability depends on meeting the needs of the capitalists. After all, they are the ones who are the prime movers of the economy, the main source of jobs and production. Policies which redistribute income and wealth away from the capitalists are viewed with a jaundiced eye by the corporations and banks, and often the politicians, and are rarely embraced, or at least voluntarily. Yet, despite the fact that almost all of the benefits that from increased productivity over the last 2 decades have accrued to the corporate sector, while compensation to workers, the unemployed, and the impoverished has stagnated or declined, we still have a severe, persistent economic crisis of stagnation. The current crisis is global and has persisted since 2007. There has been no recovery for the working class in a stagnant economy. Almost 25 million are officially unemployed in the United States, while over 205 million people are similarly looking for work and cannot find it throughout the globe. The numbers remain high as President Obama's second term begins. The banking and corporate capitalists who first received a commitment of $700 billion in bailout funds and then later were the beneficiaries of President Obama's first-term policies are effectively on strike, which is an odd thing for a capitalist. They hold about $2 trillion in cash. They're not investing it in job-creating productive activities. Why? They don't think they can make enough money by doing that, so they're just waiting. In fact, the amount of cash that they're sitting on, if we examine their international holdings as well, is actually closer to $5 trillion. In a similar vein, corporations have, over the last 2 decades, deserted what the man on the street might consider productive investments, moving instead into financial speculation and rare instruments of finance. These now account for about a quarter of economic activity in the United States. That is more than double what it was about a decade ago. This reflects a decline in the actual productive activity in the U.S. economy. It seems that the most generous offers and flows of income to the corporate sector have not restored even a modicum of prosperity and productivity. Unlike their 19th century predecessors like Jean-Baptiste Say and David Ricardo, most 20th century economists believed that capitalism was volatile, but that the fine-tuning of it by fiscal and monetary policy could in fact prevent economic problems from becoming large-scale crises. But life continues in the 21st century to be a hard teacher. Crises have become widespread and intractable. Each solution creates another problem, as we've heard already. Capitalism and its inherent internal intentions may themselves be generating crises. If so, then adjusting economic policies marginally within a capitalist framework is unlikely to prove salutary. So if we turn to the other thread of economic theory originating with Karl Marx, we encounter 2 critical hypotheses that may help us understand the current situation. One hypothesis was that profitability of capitalists tend to fall as technological progress and automation proceed. And the second hypothesis is that the competitive battle for market share among the capitalists leads to overproduction of goods and services relative to the ability of the incomes of the broad population to buy them. These hypotheses both seem to have merit in the current situation, reflected both in the anemic rebound in the economy and the continuing reluctance of capitalists to invest because their expected returns on investment are small. In fact, Andrew Kleinman, in his book, The Failure of Capitalist Production, has tested the former hypothesis about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and found an enormous amount of support for that in the period after World War II. In such a setting, a vast appreciation of capital values through a depression or physical destruction in war would be needed to restore profitability, a most dire solution to the profitability problem and one we would hope to avoid. But I think for us, then, we need to go beyond a focus on deficits or even on modest improvements around the edges of the great wound of the economic downturn and consider broader systemic change. In short, we need not only to consider policy advocacy directed at the government, but also consider policy for ourselves, for those of us who are not in the halls of power in Washington or in the corporate suites, for those who are unemployed, exploited, oppressed in myriad ways, and attacked by resurgent racism. How then do we challenge the system of capitalism? One starting point would be to understand that virtually all substantial progressive changes have emerged from mass movements, whether it be the civil rights movement, which achieved voting rights, a ban on discrimination in housing and public accommodations, and Medicare, or the bold labor movements of the 1930s and 40s that established multiracial unions, won Social Security, collective bargaining rights, welfare programs, and massive jobs programs in the midst of a depression. Mass movements, not politicians like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, made these changes happen, even though their names are associated with them. With that understanding, we need to build the organizations and movements that can replicate this process on an even higher level in the modern period. We can take some inspiration from today's Arab Spring, the Indignados in Spain, the Occupy and decolonize movements in the U.S., labor resurgence in a few isolated places in the United States, and the uprisings of the indigenous peoples of South America over the past decade. Building strength in these movements requires unity among workers, students, soldiers of all races and nationalities, with a special emphasis on closing racial gaps of all sorts. So our internal policies, then, must include unified solidarity and an understanding that ongoing struggle and contestation may lead to improvements, but even that may not be enough. And so perhaps the last 2 centuries that we have been witnessing of capitalism filled with its crises may at some day be part of the prehistory of humanity, and we may have our own future to write as we create a global movement for social progress. Thank you.